Hi everyone, welcome to our latest installment in Pinnacle's monthly webinar series. We prepared this webinar for those of you who are planning, preparing, or just curious about submitting data to China's regulatory agency, the National Medical Products Administration, or NMPA for short. Specifically, we'll cover what you need to know to comply with recently published guidelines from NMPA's Center for Drug Evaluation and Submission of CDISC standardized clinical trial data. My name is Max Kanevsky, and I'll be your presenter today. I'm the founder of Pinnacle 21 open source project and the CEO of Pinnacle 21 organization. I have spent my entire career in data standardization, supporting many of you in developing tools and solutions to help implement and ensure compliance with CDISC standards and regulatory requirements. I have also worked very closely with both FDA and PMDA to help them implement Pinnacle 21 Enterprise as a validation solution for incoming submissions. And I also had an opportunity to advise on multiple projects, including FDA's Jumpstart and CoreDF. If you have any questions during the presentation, just click on the chat bubble icon, enter your question, and I'll try to answer as many of them as possible towards the end of the presentation. Over the next 45 minutes, I'm going to cover the following topics. I'm going to talk about the new NPA requirements, what challenges these requirements pose for data validation, what are the Pinnacle 21 plans to implement these requirements. I'm going to introduce you to our first NPA engine that we recently released, and I'm going to discuss the next steps. Let's start with the new NMPA requirements. On July 20th, NMPA Center for Drug Evaluation published the guidance for submission of drug clinical trial data. You can find the announcement and the guidance at the link provided. I'll be honest, this is a very exciting moment for me, and I'm sure for many of you as well. Having China join both the United States and Japan in requesting CDISC standardized submission is a great day for our industry. It's not only going to improve the efficiency of drug review at NMPA, but it will also continue to drive clinical trial standardization efforts across the world as more and more countries realize the benefits. I was also excited and pleasantly surprised at the fast implementation timeline. The NMPA guidance is going into effect in just a couple of days on October 1st for both drugs and biologics, while effective date for traditional Chinese medicine is yet to be determined. Let's look at some of the key requirements from the guidance. As expected, the data should be in Chinese language. The format for the data is CES Export version 5, which is the same format requested by both FDA and PMDA. NPA will accept SDTM for tabulation data and ATOM for analysis data. They also will accept a define in either XML or PDF format. We, of course, recommend that you prepare a define.xml. And just like FDA and PMDA, demographics and ADSL are required, while other data sets should be submitted if applicable. In the beginning of August, at the CDISC China interchange, Mingley Hong, a reviewer from NMPA Center of Drug Evaluation, presented on this guidance. For the next few of my slides, I'm going to use her presentation as the base. Let's first look at the minimum requirements for translation. So if you have what's called a foreign language database, so your data is likely to be collected in English, there's a number of requirements that you need to follow to prepare your data for an NMPA submission. If you look at the dataset contents, the guidance requests that you translate the dataset and variable labels, that you translate adverse events and medical history terms, as well as concomitant medication and clinical endpoints. The guidance also asks that you translate the define.xml, as well as the annotated case report forms. And of course, the data reviewer guide is expected to be in Chinese. Keep in mind that as you translate the data sets and the different documents, it's important that the translation is consistent. For example, if you have terms that you're using in your data sets those terms, the translation for those terms has to be consistent in the documents such as the clinical summary reports. The next slide looks at the dataset requirements. I don't think there's any surprises here. The requirements are based on the limitation of the CES export version 5 format. But let me go over them again. The dataset and variable names should not exceed 8 bytes. The variable labels should not exceed 40 bytes, while the variable length should not exceed 200 bytes. And of course, as I mentioned, dataset and variable labels are expected to be in Chinese. One key thing to remember is that a character is not equal to a byte. When you're dealing with English language data, then that is true. However, depending on the encoding that you choose for your Chinese data, a single character might require up to 4 bytes to be represented. So as you're translating your data, keep in mind that if you have 200 characters within your English language data, it might necessarily fit when translated to China. So keep that in mind as you begin your effort. Also, if you plan to split your data sets, if they're exceedingly large, make sure you follow common practices for splitting those data sets. For example, if you're splitting lab data, split it across the category like chemistry, hematology, and your analysis. But most importantly, make sure that the rules you're using for splitting, as well as the merging details, are specified in the data reviewer's guide. The NMPA reviewers are going to need that information to reconstruct the data for analysis. The slides from CDISC China presentation are available on the CDISC website. If you're a CDISC member, you'll be able to download it from the website. Now that we understand the basic requirements, let's discuss the challenges that they present for data validation. Well, first of all, it introduces a number of new requirements that we didn't have before. One is the introduction of additional encodings. When we work with English language data, we only had to worry about Latin 1, and that's what Pinnacle 21 supported for the last 12 years. However, with Chinese data, we need to expand that to support additional encodings. For example, UTF-8, EUCCN, GBK, and potentially others. Also, a number of users reached out to us and asked us if we can translate the messages and description in Chinese to help Chinese-speaking users implement the new requirements. And of course, as we prepare the rules, we need to choose the right subset of rules that are applicable for NMPA submissions, and potentially add additional rules that are unique NPA requirements that would need to be implemented. There's a number of challenges as well. The first challenge is that CDISC is still working on Chinese translation of standards and terminology. Currently, the only translated standard is SDTM-IG 3.2, and it's available to download from the CDISC website. SDTM-IG 3.3 is currently in progress, as well as the ADAM-IG 1.1. CDISC terminology translation is also in progress. However, it's not clear yet what the scope of that translation is. As many of you are aware, the latest version of CDISC controlled terminology has over 31,000 terms, and translating all of them would be a very significant effort. So based on what we've seen from the drafts, it looks like only a subset of terminology will be translated, so the common code lists that are used in submissions. We'll have to wait until the terminology is published to really determine the final scope. There's also a number of other documents that have to be translated. For example, the defined XML style sheet, as well as the FUSE data reviewers guide templates. And of course, the NMPA business rules are not yet finalized. Now we understand the requirements and the challenges. Let's take a look at what Pinnacle is doing to address them. When we first saw the announcement in July, within a week, we received about a dozen requests from our users across the world asking us, when is Pinnacle going to support these new requirements? And this is a very common thing that happens to us after every new release of CDISC standard. or every new release of agency requirements. But just the amount of requests we received was unusually high. And that really told us that we need to move fast. So we put in place a plan that we thought can get everybody what they need while supporting the implementation deadline of October 1st. So our plan called for a quick release of initial functionality to make sure that the users can begin implementation, and then follow that up with monthly updates, introducing new functionality, adding support for new standards and new versions of standards, as well as adding new rules and tuning the existing rules that we already published. And of course, we would work very closely with all the stakeholders, including NMPA, CDISC, and our users to make sure that our interpretation and our implementation of the requirements is accurate. So let's see what we have accomplished so far. On August 24th, just over a month after NMPA announced their new guidance, we were able to release our first support for NMPA. We published a new validation engine within both community and enterprise versions of our software, and that engine is version 1907.2. In community, it's actually showing up as 1907.3, but that's due to a technical issue that we have since resolved. This first release of the engine has added support for SDTMIG 3.2, as well as SDTMIG 3.13. We selected 288 rules, and this subset we chose very carefully to make sure that we're only introducing rules where there is decent enough amount of clarity about the requirements. For example, the requirements around terminology or what variables need to be translated are not fully clear, so we try to avoid adding any of those rules that we believe were not final. We will, of course, add additional rules as these requirements become more clear for the rest of us. We also added support for the Chinese language measure dictionary. The data sets in this new engine that are Chinese, they contain Chinese data, are expected to be encoded with UTF-8. And we translated every single message and description for every single rule in simplified Chinese. For a number of years, we provided Chinese language support to our enterprise users, but with this particular release, we thought it was important to extend it to the community. And so we published a Chinese-speaking forum on our website. So if you have any questions about the new engine or any other questions, and you're a Chinese speaker, please feel free to ask those questions on our forum. So let's take a look. So where do I find this new engine and how do I use it? If you're using community or enterprise, that engine has been deployed for you automatically. You'll notice in community, when you go to the validate data screen and you open up the engine dropdown, you should see NMPA engine in the list. If for some reason you don't see that, you should really you should go down to the website, re-download and reinstall community. For enterprise, the engine is available on the data package configuration screen under the compatibility section. Now let's take a look at a couple of screenshots of what the output looks like when using the new engine. This particular screenshot is for issue details, and as you can see, Chinese language data is showing up in the value column. And this was really made possible once we added support for UTF-8. So if you're trying to run community now and this comes up all jumbled, that's because you're not using this new engine. So make sure you're using the NMPA engine to make sure that it's able to properly read Chinese characters. This screenshot is showing you the rules tab of the report. As you can see, every message and every description is now translated into Chinese. We really hope that this will help our Chinese-speaking users implement the new CDISC requirements. Well, let's take a look. What are the next steps now that we have released the first engine? So now that we released the engine in August, our plan for September called for another release. And this time, we were going to do a couple of things. One, we were going to add additional rules for SDTM. We're working very closely with all the stakeholders to understand what are the requirements, especially around the use of terminology, and what variables should be translated, which variables should not be translated. Based on that knowledge that we're gaining, we're able to add approximately additional 60 rules to the existing set. We're also adding support for validating defined.xml, of course, with all the messages and description translated into Chinese. And we're planning to translate the defined.xml style sheet into Chinese as well. And finally, our goal is to expand the supported encodings for additional encodings. So in addition to UTF-8, we're planning to support the encodings that you see on this slide. This list came from feedback we received from our early implementers for the new engine. We think this represents the most popular encoding. If you see something on this list that you expect to see, but it's not on here, please submit that request to us through either community forum or enterprise service desk, and we'll gladly add it in the next release. And I almost forgot to mention, but I'm glad to announce that we just released an updated version of the engine yesterday to implement these requirements. We also released a new version of community and new version in enterprise to support the expansion of the encodings. So how do you know if you have the latest version that we just released yesterday? In community, you'll notice on the validate data screen, there's going to be a new drop-down that showed up right under the source format. It lists out the encodings that I showed you on the slide. Same thing in enterprise. On the validate data screen, you're going to have a similar drop-down appearing right under the data package. If you do not see these drop-downs, it means you don't have the latest version. Make sure you upgrade to community 3.1 and enterprise 4.2 to get access to this functionality. And this is a screenshot of what your defined.xml will look like once you apply our new Chinese language style sheet. As you can see, the menu, the information, the slide information, the top, as well as the column headers are all now translated into Chinese. So please use it with your defined.xmls for your next NPA submission. Well, we're not done yet. We actually have another release planned for October. We're focusing on adding support for add-on 1.1. Same, all the messages descriptions will be translated to Chinese, just like defined.xml and SDTM. And we plan to continue adding additional rules for SDTM. We're hoping to add rules for CDISC control terminology as CDISC control terminology is published. We're also hoping to add any NPA specific rules as their requirements become more clear. We're also starting to collect feedback from our early implementers to understand what we should really be focused on adding in the future. One of the earliest feedback we received about the NPA engine is that the users were very happy that we translated rules, the messages and descriptions into Chinese, but a number of users voiced their interest in us translating the entire application. So the menus, the user interface, and the reports. We got similar requests from Japanese-speaking users as well. So we have been investigating doing this to both community and enterprise versions of a software. And I can tell you that just a couple of days ago, we added this to our roadmap. We're planning to translate, localize both of our application to support English, Chinese, and Japanese in the near future. We're not sure exactly of the dates, but I'm going to make sure that I'll keep you guys up to date over the next few months as our plans become clear. We hope that localizing our software in these 3 languages is going to provide enhanced usability for our technologies and really help those Chinese and Japanese speaking users that are trying to implement the CDISC requirements for their respective agencies. Also, I'll take this opportunity to mention, if you guys have any other ideas of how we can improve the software, don't be shy, submit them to us. Whether if you're an enterprise user, you can submit it to us through the enterprise service desk. If you're a community user, you can submit it to us through our website on the community forum. And of course, we are planning to continue to collaborate with the different stakeholders. We're working with NMPA to clarify the business rules. We're continuing to support CDISC's effort to translate the standards and terminology. As far as the translation at CDISC, that particular process is led by the China's CDISC committee. If you're interested in contributing, please reach out to them. I'm sure they could use your help. We're also working with Fuse to translate the data reviewers guide. We actually started this effort already. We're hoping that we can complete the translation in the next few weeks and send it to Fuse. So keep an eye on this as well. And we'll, of course, continue working with our users who have been so gracious to test our engine and provide us feedback. We got a lot of new information. We got a lot of new requests for new functionality. And of course, we're going to continue supporting our users through education. We're going to host similar webinars to this one. We're going to post blogs, and we're going to provide articles on our enterprise knowledge base. So please follow those sources of information and look for additional information about support for NMPA requirements. All right, this is my entire presentation. Now I'll go ahead and I'll respond to your questions. Let me take a look. Yes, there's actually been quite a few questions. I should be able to answer a lot of them given the amount of time I have left. Let's see, where do I start? All right, let's start with this one. What versions of CDISC standards are accepted by NMPA? So that's a good question. If you look at the guidance, there's no specifics about which versions. All it says is that they will accept SDTM and Atom, but it's not clear what versions are currently accepted. All I can tell you from our metrics is that over 80% of companies are using SDTM 3.2 and Atom 1.1. So I would recommend that you start with those two versions as the baseline. Let's see. Can we use study data already prepared for FDA submission to submit it to NMPA? So that's a really good question. From the technical perspective, if you follow the requirements that I described in my presentation, specifically requirements about how to translate, what data to translate, and what documents to translate, specifically translating the data set and variable labels, adverse event and medical history terms, concomitant medication and clinical endpoints, as well as translating your defined.xml, your ACRFs, as well as the reviewers guides. That would meet the technical requirements, and that should be sufficient to submit to NMPA. However, I suggest that you first consult with the agency, specifically with your review team, to make sure that the actual study parameters are in line with their expectations, for example, the patient population. So from the technical perspective, absolutely, but I would first check with the agency to make sure your study is appropriate. Let's see. All right, so the next question asks whether NMPA has guidance documents similar to the FDA's data standards catalog and technical performance guide. Honestly, this is the first question I asked when I saw the guidance published on July 20th. Unfortunately, we're not aware of such documents at this time. I could see how they would be very helpful for everybody, for us, and for all of our users in getting clarity about the requirements. I suspect that NMPA will publish them in the future as they get more experience with the initial submissions. But if we find these documents, we'll definitely publish them on our website, links to those documents, and we'll communicate them to all of our users. Let's see. Are Chinese versions of Fuse Reviewer Guide template available now? If not, when would Fuse translate them? I mentioned during my presentation that we are working currently on translating those documents, and we plan to share them with Fuse in the next few weeks. Let's see, there's another questions in the reviewer guide. Do I need to use the Fuse template for reviewer guide or not? That's a good question. Once again, the guidance doesn't specify which template you should use, right? So, I mean, given that the Fuse template is used widely for both FDA and PMDA, and it's a very popular template. I know from my personal experience working with FDA that it's a very successful template. I would recommend that you start using the template unless you hear otherwise from NMPA. All right. When will Pinnacle 21 finalize validation rules for NMPA submission? Yeah, we always get this question for any kind of rules we publish. I like to always answer that they will never be finalized because the requirements always change. The understanding of the agencies about the data evolves, and as far as the CDISC organization always publishes new versions of the standards, requiring us to continuously update the list. However, if you're looking for a stable version of the rules, our plan is to have it by the end of the year. So we plan to have it, so right now you can consider the existing set of rules as beta. End of the year, we're going to consider them stable with only, incremental changes happening starting next year. Here's another question about the reviewer's guide. For NMPA submissions, do I need to explain only errors like for PMDA submissions, or do I need to explain all issues just like for FDA? That's a really good question. Well, once again, there's no specifics currently from NMPA of what you need to explain or whether you need to explain it. I can tell you from personal experience that explanations in the reviewer guide in many cases are very beneficial for the reviewer to understand your data, why certain issues exist, or how your data is organized. In some cases, that explanation could be the difference between you getting an information request or not getting an information request. So I always recommend then, if possible, try to explain all your issues in the reviewer guide. It's only going to benefit all parties if they're there. Let's see. Okay, here's a question about encodings. What character encoding is recommended for NMPA? All right, that's another great question. Looking at the guidance, they don't actually recommend any particular encoding. All they're saying is that you can choose whatever encoding you want, as long as you specify the encoding you're using in the reviewer guide. Now, I know from talking to a lot of our Chinese-based users is that the most popular encodings in China are EUCCN, as well as UTF-8. But my understanding is that there's no recommendation, and as you can see, we have added a number of different encodings to make sure that we support as many users as possible. Is there an English version of NMPA validation where NMPA rules have messages and descriptions in English rather than in Chinese? Let me take a moment here to understand. I guess you're asking whether there's an NMPA engine, but with rules, messages, and description in English instead of Chinese. That's an interesting question. Well, I guess if you're preparing data in Chinese, it's expected that you have proficiency in the Chinese language. So I think that at this point, we don't have any plans to provide it in both English and Chinese. You can, of course, because the rule IDs are consistent across both engines and across languages, you can always look up what the rule means in English if you just look at our website at the list of rules. But we're going to continue listening to our users, and if this request comes in from multiple users, we might reconsider and publish it in multiple languages. But interesting question, thank you. What is the purpose of the new Pinnacle 21 Chinese-speaking forum? Is it only for questions about NMPA submissions? That's a great question. our goal for adding the Chinese-speaking forum was not just to support an NMPA submission, but to support all of our Chinese-speaking users. So please feel free to ask any questions about any of the agencies, FDA, PMDA, or NMPA, or any questions about our rules, or about our tools, or any other question that you would typically ask on our forum. So absolutely. By the way, I forgot to mention one more thing. In addition to adding the Chinese-speaking forum, we also launched a Japanese-speaking forum as well. So if you're a Japanese speaker, you'll find that we are supporting in that language now as well. Let's see, the next question is about terminology. Is Chinese version of CDISC terminology fully translated, or does it still have some terms in English? I already mentioned, so far, all we have seen is the draft, right? We haven't seen the final version of the translated terminology. By looking at the draft, what we saw is that there's definitely the use of, there's a mixed, some terminologies in Chinese, some terminologies in English. And it's not just across code lists. We have even seen cases where the same code lists have terms that are translated and some that are not. A good example would be the yes-no code list. For example, Y and N remain untranslated, but the terms unknown and not applicable have been translated into Chinese. So we'll have to wait and see until the final is published before we can truly answer this, but I suspect that it will remain mixed. Let's see. The next question is about where can I get the Chinese style sheet for define.xml? So if you're an enterprise user, you can download it from the define.xml designer. It's available from the download style sheet menu option. If you're a community user, you can go to our web page at the download section. You'll find it there. This next question is interesting. Is there any publicly available sample data for NMPA submissions, including define.xml file and reviewer's guide? Well, I can tell you when we started implementing the new engine, this is something that we looked for everywhere. Definitely this would help with implementation and testing. Unfortunately, we couldn't find any. We created some small sample data for internal purposes, but definitely nothing on the level of sample data that is provided by Fuse and CDISC. I actually think this is a great project for Fuse to address. I'm going to make sure I suggest it to them. Let's take a look. Do I need to translate all study data or only specific variables? I mean, I think this is probably the most common question we received from our early implementers so far. All I can tell you is what the minimum requirements are. And the minimum requirements is to translate your labels for both data sets and variables. You have to translate your adverse event terms and medical history terms. You have to translate your concomitant medications and clinical endpoints. I think everything else really will depend on the review team you're working with at the agency. So what I would suggest is you reach out and you talk to the review team at NMPA and ask them what their preferences are. It's possible that they would ask you to translate more than just the minimum requirements. So I would really defer that to the review team to answer that question. But at the very least, the minimum requirements are published and are provided as part of the guidance as well as the presentation from NMPA at the CDISC China conference. So at the very minimum, you will need to follow those. Can we communicate to NMPA with our questions or submit a sample submission like FDA's eData team? Well, that's another great question. So far, we have not seen an equivalent to the FDA eData team at NMPA. We're not aware of that team's existence. If anybody on this webinar knows please type it as another question, or send us an email, or post it on our forum. I think this is definitely an important question. I think a lot of users would like to send a sample submission. So let us know. We're not aware of this, but I'm gonna communicate. I'm gonna see if I can get an answer for this and post it to the community at a future date. Okay. Oh, here's a question about Community 2.2. All right, let's see what this is about. Can I use Community 2.2 for validating NMPA data? Well, I guess my first question is, why are you still using Community 2.2? Community 2.2 is now 4 years old. It is out of sync with what the FDA is using. And you really shouldn't be using an outdated version. There's really no benefit. You can just upgrade to Community 3 and get the latest validation engines that are published by all 3 agencies. So the short answer is no, you cannot use Community 2.2 to validate NMPA data, and you really shouldn't be using Community 2.2. We're actually planning to end support for version 2 sometime next year. We haven't determined the exact date yet, but I would suggest that you start planning the upgrade to version 3 to avoid losing support. The next question is about does Pinnacle plan to provide documentation in Chinese, for example, on how to use the CLI? Well, thank you for the question. As part of our effort to localize the software, translate the user interfaces, the reporting, we're also going to localize all the help documentation. So we actually plan to localize enterprise, community, as well as our website. Right. So all 3 properties will be available in all 3 languages: English, Chinese, and Japanese. I'm not sure exactly on the timeline, but it will be part of the localization effort. Can I use P21 Community to create define.xml file in Chinese? So yes, the answer is yes. You can use either enterprise or community to create define.xml for your Chinese data. You should just be aware of a couple of, you have to make sure you use the right version. So if your data is in UTF-8, you'll be okay using Community 3.0. But if your data is encoded in a different encoding, then make sure you download and use Community 3.1. This is the version where we added those additional encodings. And of course, make sure you download the style sheet that's been translated into Chinese to pair it with your new define.xml. Let's see. Can enterprise generate Chinese versions of the reviewer guide? So I think I mentioned it already. So in enterprise, we have a module that auto-generates your reviewer guide and pre-populates a lot of the sections, including the explanations and study design. We've been undergoing a process where we're translating the template, the Fuse template, so we can support this in our enterprise. So yes, in a matter of weeks, we plan to have that available. Your process in enterprise won't change. If you're creating a reviewer guide for a data package that's using an NMPA engine, it will automatically export using the Chinese version of the template. And we'll, of course, as soon as this template is complete, we will submit it to Fuse and hope that they'll publish it to the rest of the industry. Here's a good question. Where can I download Chinese language implementation guides, models, and CDISC control terminology? So currently, as far as I understand, the only document that you can download that has already been translated is the CDISC SDTM-IG 3.2, and that's available from the CDISC website. What you need to do is you can just Google for CDISC China or Chinese translation, and you should be able to find that page. That page currently only has a link to the SDTM-IG 3.2. I assume that once additional IGs or control terminology is published, it will be available from that page. So keep an eye on that page, and hopefully in the next few weeks and few months, more documents will become available. We will obviously, when that happens, we will also make sure that we'll communicate that to our users through in-app messaging in both community and enterprise. Let's see. Next question is about analysis result metadata. Here we go. So does NMPA require creating ARM in analysis defined.xml? That's a really good question. Well, there's nothing in the guidance that says that you have to create analysis result metadata, right? As you know, as you can see already, the guidance right now is very sort of, basic, right? It doesn't have a lot of details yet. All I can tell you is it's best practice for FDA and PMDA submissions to create analysis result metadata for all your primary and secondary endpoints for your study. And it's done to help the reviewer understand how your analysis were created. So I would assume that NMPA reviewers could benefit from the same knowledge. So, if it's possible, go ahead and create the analysis result metadata for your NMPA submissions as well. Let's take a few more questions as I only have a minute to go. Does Pinnacle 21 validation include checks for utilization of Chinese language per NPA requirement? I think what this is asking is whether we actually check that you translated the data into Chinese. That's a really good suggestion, actually. Well, let me think about it. I think we already partially support this because we ensure that your measure terms are in the Chinese version of the measure dictionary. So that at least ensures that your measure has been translated. We also are going to add a check for checking the data set and variable labels. But we don't have anything yet for concomitant medications or medical history. So I think this is a really good suggestion. We'll investigate and we'll see if we can add those specific NMPA checks as well. Thank you. This is a great suggestion. The next question is, where can I get the Chinese version of Medra files? So Medra publishes the dictionary in many different languages, including Chinese. And the nice thing about it is that the files are published in exactly the same format, they're named exactly the same way. So whoever is responsible in your organization for publishing these documents internally, you should ask them. They should be able to provide you the Chinese version of Medra, and it's going to be in the same exact files in the same exact format. Let's do one final question. Where can I see the full list of NMPA rules? Did NMPA publish them? Well, NMPA has not published rules yet. The only thing available now is the rules that Pinnacle has implemented to support the NMPA requirements. The easiest place for you to find them would be in the rule tab of the reports. So just run a validation, export the report in both enterprise or community, and on the rule tab, you'll see all the rules that are applicable to that standard. We are planning to publish them on our website in the near future. But of course, as soon as an NMPA publishes their set of rules, I'm sure we're gonna have to do a separate webinar to go over them and describe them in detail. Well, with this question, I'm going to wrap it up. I'd like to thank you all for joining this webinar. And thank you all for downloading and using the latest version of the engine. There's been a lot of feedback. We hope that we're able to continue to support your implementation of CDISC for submissions to NMPA. Please follow us. The question that everybody asks that I always have to answer in the end before I forget, This particular webinar is recorded. We're going to publish it on YouTube. The slides as well will be put up on our blog. You guys are going to get an email, follow-up email with the links to both the recording and the slides. And please watch out for our next webinar. There'll be one a month from now. Thank you again for joining, and see you next time.